A man, his wife's mysterious death, an outrageous trial, and a verdict that stunned the world. This is the story of Michael Peterson. In late December of 2001, a 911 call came into the Durham, North Carolina police from a resident in a quiet neighborhood. The caller explained that he had just found his downstairs neighbor slumped over his keyboard at his computer, with blood all over his shirt and the room. When emergency services arrived at the home, they found the injured man sitting on the floor next to his computer, clearly distressed, but still conscious. The man was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered a severe head wound. He told them he had no memory of what had happened or how he had sustained the injury. In fact, he had no idea who he was at all. And so it was until police located his identification documents that they learned the name of their patient, Michael Peterson, a novelist who lived in the house alone. He was a 61-year-old man who was going through a messy divorce with his second wife. The two had been arguing frequently about money and property, and according to Michael, his wife had even threatened to frame him for murder. However, when she died suddenly a few months earlier, her death was ruled as being due to natural causes. So could this recent attack be the work of Kathleen Peterson, Michael's late wife, or was there something else going on? As it turned out, the story was much more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Michael's condition stabilized after some time in the hospital, and he was released. But almost immediately, he was interviewed by the police. During the interview, Michael claimed to have no recollection of the assault, but he suggested that his wife's ghost must have attacked him, because their house had a history of strange phenomena. He also mentioned that he had fallen down a flight of stairs before, and he wondered if perhaps he might have done so again, striking his head. However, the officers didn't buy his story. They felt he was hiding something, so they went to his home to search for clues. What they found was shocking. At first glance, the house looked like any other. It was a 3-story building in a respectable neighborhood with a basement apartment. But once the officers entered, they saw it was cluttered and disordered, with dirty laundry strewn across the floors and garbage piled up in the corners. There were countless piles of papers on every available surface, and some areas were barely passable. In fact, it almost looked like a hoarder's house, which prompted the police to call in a psychologist to evaluate Michael. I think that's when things really started to unravel. The doctor conducted several tests on Michael and concluded that he was indeed suffering from amnesia. But he suspected that the novelist had made up his entire story. As far as he was concerned, Michael was malingering, meaning that he was pretending to have amnesia in order to avoid prosecution for his crime. The police were sure of it. They believed that Michael had murdered his wife, Kathleen, and he now couldn't remember doing it because he had somehow repressed the memory. But there was a problem. If they didn't have any evidence against him, they weren't legally allowed to charge him with murder. They needed a motive, a weapon, and most importantly, proof that he'd actually killed his wife. But luckily for the police, they soon got exactly what they wanted. That's because while searching Michael's home, they had found traces of his wife's blood on the carpet, along with what appeared to be traces of her DNA under the hardwood floor in the living room. They also uncovered a large sum of life insurance money that Michael stood to inherit by murdering his wife. It seemed clear to the police that he had killed her by hitting her with a heavy object, then dragging her body to the living room where he tried to conceal it. But there was one piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. How did his wife's blood get under the floorboards? Is it possible that someone had planted it there to frame Michael for murder? Or maybe there was another explanation entirely. Either way, the police were determined to find out, and they eventually brought in a specialist to help them analyze the crime scene. This individual was a forensic expert named Dwayne Dever. He was hired by the state of North Carolina to help solve the mystery of Kathleen's death, and he would play a pivotal role in the investigation moving forward. Dwayne combed through Michael S. house with a fine-tooth comb and found a number of things that interested him. For example, he examined the area where the blood was discovered and used a special camera to identify a small divot in the wood that may have been caused by a heavy object falling. However, his most interesting discovery was a set of long, thin fibers that were found near the victim's supposed crime scene. These fibers were later identified as being similar to the type of carpet that was in the couple's bedroom. But there was a big problem, according to Michael. When his wife died, her body was placed in the living room directly on the hardwood floor. Therefore, how could these fibers have gotten there? Is it possible that the killer had dragged her body across the floor from the bedroom after slaying her? Or had the police planted the fibers themselves in order to make the case look legitimate? No one knew for sure. And that's when things took a bizarre turn. After examining the evidence, Duwandir was convinced that Michael was guilty. But he hadn't considered one very important thing. His own findings could easily be interpreted as pointing to innocence. Even the fiber could be explained away by suggesting that Michael had cleaned his wife's body and put her in the living room himself. So Dewar worked quickly to prevent Michael from hiring his own lawyer and getting his side of the story. He began reaching out to different members of the press and told them what he believed had happened in the Peterson case. Duane said that Michael had obviously killed his wife in a fit of rage and then attempted to hide the body. He also pointed out that the novelist had benefited greatly from Kathleen's death, inheriting hundreds of thousands of dollars in insurance money. Soon, news outlets across the country were reporting on Duane's theories, labeling Michael a cold-blooded killer. By the time Michael was able to hire a lawyer, the jury had already been convinced of his guilt in the media. This made it nearly impossible for him to receive a fair trial. And that is why his defense team requested that the judge delay the proceedings until they could find experts of their own. But the judge refused and insisted that the trial go forward as scheduled. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, Michael was convicted of murdering his wife and sentenced to life in prison without parole. From the beginning, Michael maintained his innocence, claiming that he had no memory of killing his wife and that he certainly did and do it intentionally. Unfortunately, no one listened to him, and the case was closed. Well, not exactly. See, from the moment Michael was found guilty, his supporters began demanding a new trial. They started reaching out to journalists and filmmakers and asked them to take on his case, and it wasn't long before they were heard. In 2004, a French production company released a documentary series about the trial known as The Staircase. The series followed the twists and turns of the case and gave viewers a glimpse into the inner workings of the justice system. Along the way, it introduced them to some of the colorful characters involved in the trial, including Michael's eccentric family and the zealous prosecutor. As the series progressed, it became clear that the prosecution's case against Michael was shaky at best. For example, the so-called blood found under the floorboards turned out to be animal blood, and the fibers that Duane Dover had analyzed were never actually linked to Kathleen's body. In fact, there was no physical evidence whatsoever connecting Michael to the crime scene. Despite this, however, the jury still found him guilty. The series ended with Michael being led away in handcuffs, but his supporters vowed to continue fighting for him. For the next few years, Michael's case remained in the courts, but nothing ever came of it. It seemed as though the justice system had spoken, and there was nothing anyone could do to change its mind. However, in 2011, a new development breathed new life into the case. A member of the Innocence Project reached out to Michael and offered to help him get a new trial. The organization took on his case and began digging through the evidence, looking for anything that could prove his innocence. To their surprise, they soon uncovered a number of problems with the prosecution's case. For example, they found that the so-called blood found under the floorboards was never properly tested, and the fiber evidence was based on faulty science. Additionally, they uncovered a number of inconsistencies in the testimony of key witnesses, including the infamous Duane Dover. With this new evidence in hand, Michael's lawyers filed a motion for a new trial, and this time they finally got a favorable response from the court. In 2017, after spending 16 years in prison, Michael Peterson was finally released. Of course, this was seen as a huge victory for those who had fought for his freedom all along. But it was bittersweet because it came at such a high cost. Michael had lost nearly 2 decades of his life, and he would never get that back. Nevertheless, he was determined to make the most of his second chance. In the years since his release, he has become an advocate for criminal reform, helping others who are wrongfully convicted to get their freedom. He has also continued writing novels, publishing several new books that have been praised by critics. As for his case, it remains one of the most controversial in American history. Many people still believe that Michael Peterson is guilty, while others are convinced of his innocence. Ultimately, however, only time will tell what really happened.